Today, we want to look at factors that allow us to categorize different forms of government as this or that, dictatorship or democracy, for example. When we investigated different economic systems, you might remember that we used the criteria of how much involvement does the government have in attempting to classify that country's economy as either free market, a command economy, or something in between. A similar process will be used, although it will be only slightly more complex, as we will use two criteria in attempting to classify a country's system of government. So just because a country like, say, the oppressive regime of North Korea calls itself a People's Republic doesn't necessarily mean it's going to meet our criteria to be called a republic. And instead, in the instance of North Korea, would probably fall into the category of a dictatorship. Today, the goal is to expose you to a system that will allow us to have a better understanding of systems of government, which then hopefully gives you a better understanding of the one the United States uses. So, just like when we looked at different economies and used a spectrum on which, on the left-hand side, we had 100% government control and involvement in the economy, and thus on our economic spectrum, the left-hand side was known as the command economy, and on the economic spectrum on the right-hand side, we had 100% freedom from government intervention or involvement, and thus we had a free market. We can do the same thing with systems of government. On this spectrum, on the left, we have anarchy, which my guess is some of you have heard of prior to this discussion. And anarchy is the absence of government. It is Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. It is survival of the fittest. And no outside authority or government exists to provide law, order, or stability. Understand that this is not a system of government that, say, a country chooses, but rather it's a situation that develops when a country's government breaks down and no authority exists to provide for the well-being of the citizens. Somalia, a country in Africa that's basically run by warlords, would be a modern-day example of anarchy. In Somalia, there is no government that exists to bind the country together to provide stability and security. So it is basically a country run by individuals who've amassed a large number of weapons and followers. The vast majority of people in Somalia lead very deprived lives, lacking basic necessities, food, electricity, running water. Those are things that we here in the United States, most of us, take for granted. On the far right-hand side of the spectrum, we have fascism, the most famous example of which is fascist Italy, who was allied with Nazi Germany during World War II. Now, both fascism and Nazism exist on the far right and are very similar in that both of these systems of government believe in high degrees of government control. So, the government controls many, if not all, aspects of public and private life. Now notice, closer to the center of our political spectrum, the two major political parties of today in this country. The Democrats, represented here by the donkey and the term liberalism, and the Republicans, here represented by the elephant and the term conservatism. Understand that because they are closer to the center of the spectrum, they do not embrace the more extreme viewpoints of anarchy or fascism that you see on the far left or far right. Now, this is the most basic way of looking at government. And when you go basic, you end up missing some finer details. So this is the model we are going to begin with, but we are going to take our classification of government systems just a little bit further. Here we've kept the spectrum, for which the far left, that essentially doesn't exist in the image you're looking at, would represent zero government, And the far right, which again does not exist in the image you're looking at, would represent complete government control. And we've wiped all the system of government off the spectrum. In looking at just the American political parties, we would see that the Conservative Party or Republicans exist on the right side of the spectrum. And on the left side of the spectrum, and again, these are not the extreme far right or the extreme far left. This is a zoomed in perspective of more of the center of the political spectrum. So on the far left, we see the Liberal Party that in this country is known as the Democrats. Now, at this point, if I were to ask you what is a Republican or what is a Democrat, my guess is I'd be met with a number of blank stares. You may favor one party over another, which is natural, but if I asked you why, my guess is it'd have less to do with what you think and know and more to do with what your parents support, which isn't bad. It's often how we arrive at many of our early preferences. They're transmitted from our parents, but the goal today is to give you information that allows you to understand your preferences. So the spectrum is the most basic way of looking at systems of government. Now, let's take this a step further. Next, we're going to need to tilt our spectrum 45 degrees to the right. Then, we're going to add an X and a Y axes, which we are going to label. On the Y axis, we will label it personal freedom. So, how much freedom do you believe you should have in your personal life? Here you can see a scale that runs from 0, for which you'd believe the government should control all aspects of public and personal life. So the government would determine what books you read, what movies can be watched, what's okay to say and not, who you can marry, what god or gods you can worship. You have 0 personal freedom. On the other end, you have 100% personal freedom. In this scenario, the government makes no rules regarding what you do in your personal or public life. You want to drive everywhere going 100 miles per hour? Fine, no rule against it. You want to ingest harmful substances medical professionals may advise against? Well, there's no rule that says you can't. And if you want to walk down the street punching everyone you meet, go for it. You don't have to worry about the police detaining you, but you may want to watch out for the people who hit back. The bottom line is most people probably don't support either extreme, either 0 personal freedom or 100% personal freedom, but rather most people probably fall somewhere towards the middle. This is our first criteria for classifying government: personal freedom. The x-axis is then labeled economic freedom, or how involved should the government be in terms of the economy. Here, if you think businesses and individuals within an economy should be able to do whatever they choose, then you would find yourself close to the 100 end of the spectrum. Here you are believing that businesses and individuals should have 100% freedom from government intervention as it relates to the economy. That means no minimum wage laws. Let businesses pay workers whatever workers are willing to accept. No regulations on businesses regarding how they conduct business. No need for, say, government regulations requiring automobile manufacturers to include airbags or seatbelts in their vehicles. That infringes on freedom to choose. To choose to pay for such an item in a vehicle or not. Or no inspection of food or medicines on the part of the government, because they would once again infringe upon individuals and businesses' ability to transact amongst themselves without government intervention. Now, again, you probably don't have many that feel that strongly in regards to freedom from government intervention, but that's the world of 100% freedom. It brings freedom from government involvement in the economy. On the other side of the x-axis, we would have 0 economic freedom. for individuals and businesses within an economy. So here, the government would decide everything: what products are made, how many of them will be made, how much do those products cost, how much do you get paid. Essentially, the government makes all decisions within an economy involving resources, both human and otherwise, because individuals and businesses have zero freedom to decide. Again, this is an extreme viewpoint, not representative of the majority, and therefore, very few people would advocate such a position. Then we close off the XY axes, making a box. Lastly, we reorient our box 90 degrees and we have what is referred to as a Nolan chart, by which we can look at systems of government a little more critically. Let's continue our discussion by looking at America's two predominant political parties in terms of the Nolan chart to better understand what each side holds as its core ideas and principles. In moving from left to right, we'll look at the Democrats or liberals first. If we look at liberals or Democrats first on the personal liberty scale, what do you notice? Are liberals or Democrats in favor of more or less individual freedom in your private and public life? Correct. We would see that liberals or Democrats favor relatively higher degrees of personal freedom. However, when we look at economic freedom, where do we see liberals or Democrats on this scale? Correct. Here we see liberals or Democrats favoring less freedom, not no freedom, but less freedom, meaning liberals or Democrats favor more government intervention in the economy. Shifting our attentions to the right and the conservative Republican Party, what do you notice when we investigate conservative Republicans on the personal liberty scale? Are conservatives or Republicans in favor of more or less individual freedom in your private and public life? Correct. We would see that conservatives or Republicans favor relatively lower degrees of personal freedom as compared to liberals or Democrats. Again, not saying they favor no personal freedom, just less than liberals or Democrats. Moving to economic freedom or liberty, where do we find conservatives/Republicans? Here, we see a leaning toward more economic freedom, meaning less intervention in the economy on behalf of the government. Let individuals and businesses interact as best they see fit without interference from the government would be the viewpoint of Republicans. So, what does it look like when we discuss real-world issues? So, when it comes to real-world issues, liberals or Democrats would favor high degrees of personal freedom. So, a military draft where the government tells people, hey, we're short on soldiers, so we just signed you up for service to aid the war effort, this would be something that clearly infringes upon your right to choose what to do with your life. So, this would be something that the liberal Democrats would oppose. Whereas, when we look at economic freedom, liberals or Democrats would favor something like a minimum wage law, which tells businesses you have to pay people at least this amount. A minimum wage law would be an example of the government intervening in matters of business. Democrats or liberals would generally be okay with this, whereas conservatives or Republicans would, generally speaking, be opposed to such government involvement. When we look at conservatives or Republicans, when it comes to what to do in public or in the privacy of your own home, they believe that there needs to be a little more regulation on the part of the government. So today, when you see more and more states moving to legalize cannabis for recreational use, Typically, Republicans or conservatives would oppose such a measure. And again, don't mistake legalization of drugs as an endorsement to use them. The legalization of drugs simply gives people the choice as to whether or not you are going to put a mood altering substance into your body. It does not guarantee that it's safe. But typically, liberals or Democrats would be more inclined to allow a legal adult to make such a decision for themselves, whereas the Republicans or conservatives would advocate that, for the good of society, the government should curtail such actions. Now, when it comes to the economy, we see a different position. Here, the conservative or Republican viewpoint would be hands off on the part of the government. Let free markets rule. So they would be in favor of, say, fewer taxes. When the government taxes you or businesses, they are most definitely involving themselves in your economic matters. So a traditional conservative approach to taxes is let's lower them or let's get rid of them. And here we can see the Nolan chart populated with all the other systems of government and a few more that you saw earlier in the more simple political spectrum. Hopefully, using two variables, personal liberty and economic liberty, gives you a better understanding of what these different approaches to government advocate. And on this slide, you can see some famous historical figures plotted on the Nolan chart. Here you can see third president, Thomas Jefferson, more of a libertarian than a modern-day Democrat or Republican. Over here, you can find modern-day conservative hero, Ronald Reagan. On the opposite side of the diamond, we find the much revered Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who led America during the Great Depression and World War II. Down here, we find the founder of communism, German Karl Marx. Remember, communism is another name for a command economy, an economy in which the government makes most of the decisions related to the economy. So, no surprise to see on the economic freedom scale a relatively low degree of freedom relative to Karl Marx and his viewpoints concerning the economy. Lastly, we can see a couple of infamous dictators, former Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and former Nazi Germany Führer Adolf Hitler. Not surprisingly, these dictators favored low degrees of freedom, both economically and in people's personal lives. Understand that there are alternatives in America to the Cokes and Pepsis that the Democrats and Republicans represent. There are other political parties. However, they are not exactly mainstream and thus don't have the kind of financial muscle to get their message, position, and candidates on the airwaves or the billboards, not in the way that Democrats and Republicans can. There are, for example, libertarians, whose name is derived from the word liberty or freedom. So no surprise when you find the libertarians on the chart that they occupy a location espousing less government intervention in both personal and economic lives. And lastly, at least for our discussion, we have statists, which in and of itself does not have a political party per se, but you will find from time to time candidates running in elections who run on statist platforms. Statists are sort of the inverse of libertarians and would, instead of freedom from government in personal and economic matters, statists would favor greater degrees of government control in both areas. So you would generally find them somewhere south of center. That's a detailed enough description of different approaches to government, but what is government? It seems a rather simple question because you hear about it all the time. The government did this, the government should do that. Darn government. Yet, despite its ubiquitous presence, it can be hard to define what it is so that we have a clear idea of what we're talking about when we say we're going to spend half of our time together learning about government. Our book effectively describes government as an authority for a community or society. So government exists to bring safety and stability to different areas or regions by using authority to accomplish tasks for large groups of people that these people would otherwise be unable to accomplish individually. And according to the text, government has a number of goals, the first of which is keep order. Society tends to prosper in all ways a person can prosper when they live in peaceful, stable environments. It's hard or perhaps pointless to build a life for oneself when every day the possibility exists that the sky could figuratively fall on your head. If that's your reality, why try when it can all be senselessly taken from you? So, government exists to try to create a peaceful, stable environment that allows for progress to take root and blossom. This is often accomplished by the passage of laws or rules that create a common understanding of what behaviors or actions are tolerable and what is not. These laws are the glue that keep our society together, and it's a precarious balance. It's a balance between protecting the individual rights of people within a society while at the same time looking out for the society as a whole. And there are a great many ideas and hence political parties in regards to how people feel government should accomplish this. Somewhat related is the idea of providing security. This is essential to the stability of a nation. This is something that if no government existed would be left up to the individual and we'd find ourselves regressed into a Mad Max survival of the fittest type environment. So instead, we empower a government to, on our behalf, act in a way to defend citizens and their property. And once again, there are a diverse many opinions as to how this should be accomplished. We also look to government to provide services to the public. You see this list there before you that includes libraries, education, repairing and maintaining our infrastructure like roads, inspecting our food and medicine, etc. These are services that many of us nod our head to in agreement with. However, there was a time when there was argument over whether or not the government should be providing these services. Just like there are arguments still today about the extent to which the government should provide for its citizenry. Just remember from our time learning about financial literacy that any services that are provided by the government, they're ultimately paid for by the citizens in the form of taxes. So you want the government to provide more services? Expect to pay more in taxes. You want to pay less taxes? Then prepare to forfeit some services. You can't have it both ways. More service and lower taxes, and anyone who promises you that is lying. The government also serves as a guide to the community, as it establishes standards and endorses behaviors and approaches that should lead to safer and more prosperous lives on the part of the nation's citizens. Hopefully you remember that the U.S. Constitution created a system of government known as federalism. However, the U.S. Constitution is also based on the idea of democracy. Now, democracy is usually a word that gives people a positive sensation or feeling. You may not know how to define it, and it is a simple definition, but we know, raised in a land of democracy, that it's good. Democracy simply means rule by the people, which sounds great, right? If there is going to be some authority in a country telling us what to do, shouldn't the people have a say in that authority? When we look at all the systems of government that are out there, understand that there is no perfect system. Some are certainly more appealing than others, but there is no one perfect government. Even when we look at democracy, which probably does offer the most benefits, we can see blind spots and drawbacks. This is most famously illustrated by the idea that democracy could be described as two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. If this was the scenario, what's on the menu? So in this example, democracy works great for the wolves, but not so much for the sheep. Understand that again, while democracy gives people the greatest voice in their government, it does not mean that everyone gets what they want all the time. No government exists that can provide that type of experience. Now, there are a couple of different flavors of democracy, so to speak, and we are going to look at two. The first of which is direct democracy, which is the purest form of democracy because it allows all citizens to vote on every action the government takes. So you have a say in all decisions. Let me ask you, does this sound like what we do in the United States? No, we don't vote on every decision. That would be way too time consuming. This type of democracy works best in small groups, in which there'd be time to hear all opinions, have discussion, and then vote quickly to take some type of action. In a country the size of the United States, both in terms of land area and population, this is simply not practical. Instead, the United States practices a form of democracy known as representative democracy. This form of democracy still gives people a say in their government. It doesn't, however, allow the people to vote on every issue. Instead, the people vote for candidates who promise to do X, Y, and Z on behalf of voters if they are elected. So this is why elections are important. It's these moments every 2 years or every 4 years that give people a chance to weigh in on the choices of the government. If you are satisfied with the decisions and actions made by the government since the last election, then reward those government officials by casting your vote to send them back to their position of authority. And if you are dissatisfied, if they have not delivered on the promises that caused you to vote for them in the first place, then express that displeasure by voting for the other guy or gal. It is important also to note that a representative democracy is also known as a republic, which is why every morning you pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. Now, in American democracy, we have some principles that provide further insight into what we look for on the part of our government. The first of which is rule of law. This is the idea that no one, not even the president, is supposed to be above or below the law. We also believe in limited government. The founding fathers went to great lengths to put limits on the government. Instead of handing the government a figurative blank check and saying, do whatever you must to take care of me, the founding fathers knew that a government without checks is a government primed to one day abuse its power. A famous quote by an English lord named Lord Acton famously stated, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely." And if history is your record, you can find plenty of examples to prove this out. We also abide by the idea of government by consent of the governed, or popular sovereignty. This idea appears all the way back in the Declaration of Independence. This is the idea that the only reason our government has power is because we consent or agree to give it power. Third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, even went so far as to say that when government abuses their power, the people should abolish their government. So understand that while the government is an authority, it exists to serve the people. This is not true of every government in every country around the world. In some of those countries, the people exist to serve the government. We also believe in protecting the rights of individuals. This harkens back to the idea of the two wolves and the sheep voting on what's for dinner. While we do look to make decisions based on majority rule, we are also a nation that guarantees certain protections to individuals that cannot be infringed upon by the government. This is meant to guard against a government freely abusing its citizens or lambs continually ending up on the dinner plate. Lastly, we have representative government, which affords us the right to choose our leaders in free and fair elections. Lastly, we want to look at two alternatives to democracy that you may have heard of previously. The first of which is an absolute monarchy. This is a form of government with a hereditary king or queen, who could be called an emperor or an empress or a czar or a czaress, and this person rules until they die or resign, at which point usually the eldest male heir would assume authority. Here there are no elections, there is no rule by the people. There is the word of the king or the queen, and that is all. Today, there are not many absolute monarchies left. Most of the kings and queens you hear about today are part of constitutional monarchies, which limit the powers and in some cases afford zero powers to their monarchs. Probably the most famous monarchy known to most Americans is the British monarchy, which really exists as more of a symbol of England's past history as opposed to actually ruling the country. So gone are the days of the king or queen of England yelling, "Off with your head." Instead, England is ruled by their elected parliament or lawmakers, in addition to their prime minister. And finally, we have an authoritarian government or dictatorship. This is a system of government in which all the power is held by someone or someones not necessarily chosen by the people. Oftentimes, these countries publicly claim that they are democracies. However, upon closer inspection of the inner workings, you notice a lack of the core principles of democracy and often find highly restrictive nations whose government's sole goal is to preserve their own power. A great example of this today is North Korea, which refers to itself as the Democratic People's Republic. And if you've seen or read anything about North Korea in the news, you know it's far from a democracy or a republic and bears a strikingly similar resemblance to all the characteristics of an authoritarian, totalitarian government or dictatorship.